No, get that off there. Popular lore says the Porsche 924 isn't a Porsche at all and is instead a Volkswagen with a Porsche badge on it. And popular lore is correct. But popular lore is also completely wrong because the 924 exemplifies what Porsche does better than anyone else. Take something that should never work and make a world beater out of it. Back in the day, German companies' legal names tended to include a description of what they did. Porsche, you'll note, wasn't Porsche Cars, Inc. It was Honorary Doctor of Engineering F. Porsche, Construction and Consulting Services for Engines and Vehicles, LLC. Porsche was an engineering consulting company that occasionally built its own cars. That's a very important distinction between them and a car company. While Porsche consulted for many companies, its biggest client was Volkswagen. This was a VW consulting gig named EA425. Volkswagen hired Porsche to develop a sports coupe, having not yet decided whether it would be marketed as a Volkswagen or an Audi. But one thing was for sure, it needed to be inexpensive, so it needed to be a parts bin special. And that meant engineering it out of parts straight out of the Volkswagen parts catalog, like this. And that, and this, and that, and that, and this, and that, and oh, look at that. Yep, that's Volkswagen. VW also. Porsche settled on a front-engine, rear-drive layout. It would use the newly updated 2-liter 4-cylinder from the Volkswagen LT cargo van, an Audi-engineered overhead cam version of an old Daimler engine from the 1960s. And because of Audi's longitudinal layout, Porsche could take the Audi 100's 4-speed manual and bolt it right in the back. So it did, bell housing and all. The 924's front suspension was half from the Super Beetle and half from a rabbit. Its rear suspension was from the Microbus, using half shafts from the Thing. And its brakes were from the Volkswagen K70 sedan, which you've never heard of, but that means it had rear drums. Even most of the interior was off-the-shelf VW parts, making the EA425 cheap and easy to produce. Except that right about when it was about to start production, VW found itself in the middle of a post-Beetle financial crisis. With a new boss, and he said he needed a purpose-built sports coupe like he needed a hole in the head. What's wrong with a hole in the head? You already have 7 of them. For its sports car, VW would instead simply make a low-roofed, sexy body version of its new Rabbit, slap a Scirocco badge on it, and call it a day. Problem solved, except that Porsche had been banking on using the EA425 for itself. Volkswagen paid for the whole thing, so it retained ownership of the whole project. And that left Porsche without a car. So Porsche struck a deal to buy it back from Volkswagen. Audi would build the thing at its plant in Neckarsulm, agreeing to supply up to 100,000 of the 2-liter engines. And over time, Porsche would reimburse 40 of the 50 million Deutschmarks Volkswagen had spent on development. Porsche did literally nothing to the EA425 but put its own badges on it and invented the number 924. Unlike other Porsche model names, this had no meaning. It wasn't its internal code because it was never a Porsche product. But while Porsche was working on the transaxle EA425, it was applying that knowledge to its own transaxle car, the V8-powered 928. 924 seemed like a really good number for a 4-cylinder car that sat next to the V8 928. And so these two front-engine water-cooled cars would make a 2-pronged replacement for the 911. Which was the dumbest thing ever. And this was a really big deal because they abandoned everything we knew about Porsche. Prior to these cars, Porsche had only ever made air-cooled mid and rear engine cars. And so Car and Driver called this front-engine heresy and then did a whole essay asking whether Porsche had lost the faith. It took them a couple years to figure that out, but the answer was absolutely not. The 924 immediately started winning comparison tests. Its ace card was balance. The transaxle design helped with perfect weight distribution and resulted in a high polar moment of inertia, the exact opposite of what you see in mid-engine sports cars. Meaning, when the 924 started to get sideways, it did so slowly and progressively. So not only was it perfectly balanced, but it was easy to manage at its limit. The handling accolades are all the more stupendous considering where its suspension came from. It has torsion bars at the back, for crying out loud. But there was a limitation. The primitive suspension gave it, quote, about the worst freeway ride of any car Road and Track had ever tested. Part of that had to do with the powertrain. See, the engine, the torque tube, and the transaxle were all mounted to each other as one rigid assembly. And the natural frequency of that assembly matched the frequency of expansion joints on American highways at American highway speeds, which meant that the whole powertrain started to do this, and then so did you.
That's disturbing.
Right? And so therefore, Porsche had no choice but to go fix it. In response to criticism, Porsche promised that the 924 would develop like a real Porsche. What they meant was that they were about to set sail on an OCD-fueled 20-year mission to fix literally everything quote-unquote wrong with the 924. It's this kiss that turned the 924 from a toad into a prince in a way that only Porsche could ever do. First order of business were small things like fixing the ride, giving it four-wheel disc brakes, and swapping in the 5-speed manual that it should have had from the get-go. And then came the big problem, that 95 horsepower Audi 2-liter from a Volkswagen cargo van. The interim solution was to turbocharge, and man did the 924 turbo stop all the complaints. But there was a much bigger problem looming. The contract with Volkswagen specified up to 100,000 Audi engines, and the 924 was about to hit that mark. Porsche needed a new engine. Porsche's engineers thought about chopping 2 cylinders off the 928's new V8, resulting in a 3.5-liter V6. To test the theory, they crammed in an all-aluminum Peugeot Renault Volvo V6 and said, 9! They also tried an Audi 5-cylinder but decided against it, too. Once again, the problem was the transaxle layout. Look, the 924 has a driveshaft that's 67 inches long, but only 3/4 of an inch thick, and it's spinning at full engine speed. The engine's vibration characteristics need to be perfectly matched to such a long, thin shaft to avoid it looking like this. In the end, Porsche decided a 4-cylinder was still the best option. And they could make one by chopping the 928's 5-liter V8 in half. Though in typical Porsche style, they just couldn't stop engineering and wound up developing a 2.5-liter 4-cylinder that didn't share a single part with the 5-liter V8 that it was half of. To keep that enormous 4-cylinder smooth, it needed balance shafts. And that meant Porsche had to pay royalties to the owner of the patent of the balance shaft. And that was Mitsubishi. You can be absolutely certain that drove Porsche crazy to have to pay Mitsubishi for something, because let's be honest, the Germans looked down on the Japanese. But Japanese engineering works, and that was a very smooth engine, and not just for a 4-cylinder. It drew comparisons to 6s and 8s, and it certainly made the power, enough to drop the 924 0-60 from 10 seconds down to 7.5, which was just as fast as the 924 turbo. With a real Porsche engine finally powering the 924, Porsche wanted to make a splash and decided to make a wide-body 924 to debut it. That became the Porsche 944. New name, but it wasn't a new car. The 944 was just a facelifted 924 with the new engine and box-flared fenders to fit a much wider track. But the 944 set the world on fire. It was gorgeous, sold out, waitlisted, and it still had Beetle suspension. Praise was heaped on the 944, the likes of which you wouldn't even believe. And then it won Car and Driver's Award for the best handling car in the world. Now that Porsche was done developing the new engine, it finally had the resources to address the interior. The 1985.5 944 finally got its own real Porsche interior. But because of a weakening Deutschmark, the 944 was getting more expensive by the second. To help that, Porsche threw its new 2.5-liter into the old narrow-body 924 and kept selling it as the 924S. That was this car. And if you think the 924S is somehow less than, think again. It was only 0.3 of a second behind the 944 around Willow Springs, according to Road and Track, and it was just as quick in a straight line, except at higher speeds where it was quicker. Thanks to its narrower body, the 924S had a top speed 7 miles an hour greater than the 944's. And if you know Porsche, you know that Porsche never stopped developing it. The 2.5-liter 8-valve got a turbo, making the 157-mile-an-hour 944 turbo the fastest car sold in America. Then the 944 got a 16-valve head, and then a displacement bump to 2.7 liters, and then another to 3 liters, and then a whole new body again. The 968, which was another name chosen at random, was another facelift on that same old body. It actually almost got a BMW M50 straight six, or indeed a different straight six that Porsche was developing for Volvo on a different consulting gig. But in the end, once again, Porsche's engineers decided a 4-cylinder was the only way to go. So they took the 3-liter 16-valve and gave it variable valve timing. Now it made 236 horsepower, which is 2.5 times the power of the original 924. That was enough to get it to 60 in 5.6 seconds, which is still quick today. Unlike the 924 and 944, the 968 was glued to the showroom floor. A couple of makeovers couldn't disguise that it was a 20-year-old car, but that wasn't the only problem. By now, the dollar was at record strength relative to the Deutschmark, and so while the 924 was not cheap, and the 944 was a lot of money, the 968 was criminally expensive, when at its age it should have been getting cheaper. It was killed after 4 unprofitable years, and that was the right choice, because it freed up money and resources to develop the new water-cooled 986 and 996. And besides, the 4-cylinder transaxle cars had already done their job. They made enough money to keep the lights on in Weissach. Without the 924 and the 944, there would be no 911 today, because there would be no Porsche. We all use the 911's continual refinement as the prime example of Porsche never giving up on an idea. After all, the 911 took the Beetle's general powertrain concept and evolved it into the best sports car of all time. The same thing happened here. Porsche mixed and matched a bunch of cheap old Volkswagen parts on a consulting gig, inherited it, and then whittled away at all of its flaws until it became one of the best sports cars of all time. Okay, so you're just gonna keep the Ferrari framed out the entire time, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Action.
I'm not some rich YouTuber asking you to like and subscribe. Hey, up, keep the Ferrari out. I'm an automotive journalist asking you to like and subscribe. And that's because that's how YouTube works. If you don't click those buttons, YouTube doesn't know you liked what you've just seen and isn't gonna show you any more of it. And if you don't like what you've just seen, well, join the club. And by that, I mean the Hagerty Drivers Club, which gets you access to this award-winning magazine, as well as discounts on amazing stuff. And if you still don't like what you've seen, well, then just leave a nasty comment, because that's how the internet works. I need to go clean that up.